talk today about an issue that I've seen a few times regarding Kerberos authentication, and it relates to the JDBC driver that we have from Microsoft. And so the way it started was there were a few customers, I think there was actually 4 within the last 2 months, that called in on a specific error that they were getting when they tried to use Kerberos with the JDBC driver that Microsoft produces. So to show you the error that they're getting, let me just run this really quick. And what we'll see here in a second is an error that indicates that the driver wasn't configured for integrated authentication. Okay, so we can see here that that's the error, SQL Server exception. This driver is not configured for integrated authentication. This error only pops up in one spot within the driver, and that has to do, in this case, where you're looking at it, the previous line before it kind of gives you a clue. It indicates that it couldn't find or load the SQL JDBC_auth.dll. That DLL is a native DLL that the JDBC driver uses to make the Windows API calls to establish Kerberos communication. So it will call into that native DLL, and then the native DLL will in turn call the Windows APIs for doing Kerberos operations, so like initialize security context and so forth. So what happened was these customers were running it, they were getting this error, but they weren't necessarily seeing the one before this. So all they saw was this driver is not configured for integrated authentication, and they didn't know what to do. The other key environment piece from their perspective that's different from what I'm showing here is that they were on a Linux platform, not a Windows platform. And what makes that interesting is that the SQL JDBC_auth.dll is only usable on the Windows platform. You can't use that DLL on a Linux platform. So the error made sense in the fact that it was trying to load that DLL and it can't, and therefore you can't use Kerberos from that perspective. So starting in the JDBC 4.0 driver that we produced, we allowed the ability to use a command called Java Kerberos for the authentication scheme within the driver. And what this does is allows you to use the native Java APIs for Kerberos as opposed to invoking the SQL JDBC_auth.dll. And what this does is it uses the Java platform and not the Windows platform for making those Kerberos calls. So on a Linux platform, you can use, with the JDBC 4.0 driver that we have, and later, you can use Kerberos on a Linux platform. You're not restricted to Windows-only platform. So before the 4.0 driver, you could only do Kerberos on the Windows platform. And so that changed with the 4.0 driver. So one of the things we found, though, is that if you set authentication scheme to native authentication on the Linux platform, you'll get this error. And by default, authentication scheme is set to native authentication. So you'd actually have to specify the Java Kerberos for authentication scheme within your connection string to get that to work. The other thing we found, though, was that like the last customer I worked with, was they were running on WebSphere 8.5, and it looks like the WebSphere 8.5 release actually comes with the 3.0 version of the SQL JDBC driver. So even if you specify authentication scheme equals Java Kerberos, it'll ignore it because it doesn't know anything about it, and so you'll still get this error. So one of the things to make sure is that you've got the right driver in place, and then after you've got the right driver in place, you need to go through and make sure you've got all of the configurations set up from a Java perspective on the Linux platform or the Windows platform, at which point then you can use Java Kerberos. So to illustrate, we do have documentation that talks about what the configuration needs to be. I'll provide links in the description for where this is at. And this documentation kind of talks about the new Java Kerberos implementation. It talks about the SQL JDBC_auth.dll. Here we talk about authentication scheme Java Kerberos. You also have to specify integrated security. And then down below it will actually talk about what we need to do. So there needs to be a login module configuration file. This is typically defaulted to the SQL JDBC driver. By default, if it doesn't exist, we're going to automatically create one using what you see here for the ComSun, the Kerb5 login module. So if you need to use a different login module, then you need to go and specify that and make sure that that's available in your Java properties. After the login module is done, we need to create the Kerberos configuration file. So this is usually like kerb5.ini on the Windows platform or kerb5.conf on the Unix Linux platform. So that needs to be configured properly so that we can, so that Java can identify where your domain, what domains are valid, and where they're located from a settings perspective. The Kerb5 or the Kerberos configuration file, that's something from a Linux perspective, you may have to work with whoever your Linux administrator is to get this configured properly. But that does need to be configured and set up. After that, once all of that's in place, you also will need to generate key tab files from a Linux perspective, and then that's what establishes the tickets and where the principals are located. After that point, the JDBC driver should work normally. So let me show you. I've got a Kerberos test.java file, and this one is actually using authentication scheme equals Java Kerberos. I'm specifying where my kerb5.conf file is, which has my my Kerb setup. And if I go ahead and run that, oops, then this actually works fine, and I've connected successfully. Otherwise, I would have gotten an error. So once everything's in place, the key tab files are there, the kerb5.ini or .conf files in place, and optionally, if you need the login configuration for the module piece, if all of that's in place, then this should work. One other thing I've done, another customer kind of worked with me on this, but I have I've used a test file before to basically validate, is the Kerberos piece of Java actually working? Like, can we validate that, take the JDBC driver out of the picture, does that work? And from that perspective, if we run, so that should come back and show us, given that our service ticket was generated, and if we kind of scroll up a little bit, we can see that it went through and communicated with the domains, and we actually went and got the service ticket correctly. So this should work. If it doesn't work, then there's something wrong with the Java environment. If we were to actually call the native Java APIs. This is pretty much exactly what the JDBC driver is doing when you do Java Kerberos for the authentication scheme. So if it doesn't work, then we need to go get that fixed, and that's probably either going to be because of the kerb5.conf file, or it's going to be because of the key tab files, or because of the login module. And so you'd have to go get that fixed before the Java driver is going to actually start working properly for you. The other thing I wanted to talk about that causes some confusion is the actual version information for the Java driver itself. So we've got a couple different drivers. We've got, so we had the 4.0 driver, which is where the Java Kerberos was released, and then we just released the 4.1 driver. So from a file name perspective, the SQL JDBC 4.jar is the file that I was using. The 4 within the file name does not necessarily dictate the version of the driver, although it actually does for the 4.1 driver, ironically. So I've kind of got a table here that kind of lays out the actual version of the driver from Microsoft's perspective, the names of the jar files that are released with that driver, the JDBC API support that's for that driver, and then what JVM we actually support that driver on. So one of the problems we had with the WebSphere 8.5 was it used the 1.6 JVM, and so we can't use the SQL JDBC 4.1.jar, so the 4.1 driver can't use that on the 1.6 JVM. You'll actually get a JVM error. So you have to use the 4.0 driver specifically on the 1.6 JVM. So there's just been a lot of questions and confusion about what can I use where, and what's the file name, where, what does it support. We do have information on system requirements for the JDBC driver, but I've just kind of put this table together to try and clarify that a little more. So on the system requirements documentation that we do have, this does spell out the different jar files. It spells out what JVMs are supported and whatnot. So hopefully this can help you with that. With regards to the actual configuration for Linux, there's also a blog that I'll reference that kind of goes through the steps for getting this working. And I thought this was a good blog that kind of walked through that in terms of creating the curb5.ini. It also talks about the differences between Linux and Windows in terms of locations of where that goes. Then it talks about doing a kint test. Also talks about how to create the key tab files on the Windows platform, and then goes through doing klist as well as actually running your application to test properly. So I'll reference that as well to help you try and figure out how to create the key tabs properly and what the ini file needs to be. Also within this documentation we do have examples of what these should look like, so you can use that as well. Hopefully this clears this up. Like I said, I've had 4 calls in the last 2 months, and so if you're trying to get this to work on the Linux environment, make sure you've got the right driver. So you need the 4.0 driver or later. And then also you need to have the configuration set up from a Kerberos perspective for Java. It's very important that you go do that. Once all that's done, it should work. The other thing I'll call out is a limitation that we found, and that has to do with dealing with cross-domain activity. What we found is that in order to actually connect successfully to SQL Server is that your default domain has to be the domain, the default domain within the Kerberos configuration file, or the curb5ini or curb5comp, has to be the domain where the SQL server is located. If you have multiple SQL servers in different domains, you're going to end up with issues because you can only specify one default domain, and it's a limitation on the way that the JDBC driver is written. So it's that's just how it is. It's not we don't have a fix for it at this time, so just be aware that if you are doing multiple domains and you end up with SQL servers in different domains and you're trying to get all that to work with Kerberos, you're going to have to pick one and go with it. The others will not work. So, all right, hopefully this helps you out. Thanks for watching.